What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry, and today we gotta talk about the Devil May Cry show. Consider this a review, analysis, breakdown. Essentially, I'm gonna be giving you my thoughts and feelings on the characters, the world building, and just the show overall. Devil May Cry Season 1 can be considered a success on multiple fronts. It debuted at number 4 on Netflix's global top 10 list. It achieved 5.3 million views in just 3 days. And it achieved critical acclaim, boasting a score of 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. It also caused a wave of new DMC fans to go and swarm the games, with games like the HD collection on Steam, for example, seeing the highest concurrent player numbers that they've ever seen since that game launched. So with all of that in mind, it's no surprise that the show recently announced it'd be getting a Season 2. That's irregardless of the fact that when Adi Shankar and Alex Larson were writing for the show, they had written with several arcs in mind already. Despite this, not all is well in Wonderland. If you take a look at any of the spaces Devil May Cry fans occupy on social media or in places like Reddit, you'll see that this show is rather polarizing, with many people considering it to be either okay, above average, some even considering it great. A large proportion of people consider it to be one of the worst DMC projects in history. We've even seen appalling behavior from some so-called fans, attacking mainstays in the DMC series like Casey Edwards, composer of DMC5, or even Johnny Young Bosch, the voice actor for Nero and Dante, of course, in the show, purely for putting their positive viewpoint forward. But with that context aside, let me delve into some of my thoughts. Let's start with Dante, who is meant to be the main character of the show. Young and inexperienced, unlike any way we've ever seen him before in the games. We're going to draw some comparisons to DMC3 here, considering that that's where most of the similarities start to lie. But this Dante is so inexperienced that he doesn't really know anything about his own history, and I think this is where some of the accusations of mischaracterization start to creep in. Though this Dante in the show can sometimes be a little aloof and playful, particularly when fighting enemies on equal footing, he seems to be a whole lot goofier, and not particularly in a way that I think does the character justice. You got a sense that Dante in the games was competent, which is where his cocky and brash attitude came from. Whereas this Dante sometimes came across as if he had no idea what he was doing, which I think is why you typically see the character Lady in the show not trust him with anything really, or refer to him as completely stupid. And we see some of this shine through in the rest of Dante's character as well, and through his actions in the show, continuously being kidnapped, him being beaten up, him being wounded in ways he's never been wounded before in the games. I suppose what they were trying to do here is show Dante in a more vulnerable light, and in a way that we've not seen him before, to perhaps make him appear more human in how he is not this superhero or superhuman that we see him be in the games, where he fights against insurmountable odds and almost never makes a mistake. There were some interesting streaks of his character that shone through, particularly how he never wanted to take on cases that he had to care about, striking some parallels to the first Devil May Cry novel, I suppose, where Dante fought and took on the mantle of Tony Redgrave to distance himself entirely from Dante and his past. And it wasn't until in that novel traumatic incidents happened, which I won't necessarily spoil, that forced him to take up the mantle of Dante once more and go off to face Gilver in the finale of that novel. I think primarily one of the larger issues that I had with Dante in the show is overall the lack of a competent character arc. If you look at Dante at the start and the end of the show, the main difference is he finally has his devil trigger, which he didn't really get to use all too much throughout the show, and he didn't really, I suppose, lock in, so to speak, until he heard that Virgil was still around, right at the very 11th hour of the final episode, where we finally saw Dante's strong conviction come to light. I think it's a bit of a meme or a bit of an overzealous thing to say that the show is Lady May Cry, but there was a lot of screen time dedicated primarily to Lady and the White Rabbit, which, you know, depending on how you feel about those characters, you'll either love or hate. But I wish that we would have seen more of Dante. If they had delved into Dante or even the Sons of Sparda's backstory, similar to how they did for Lady and the White Rabbit, I feel like that would have alleviated potentially a lot of the issues that people might have had with Dante's limited time on screen. Ultimately, there are definitely a lot of flaws with this Dante, and I'd like to see him be more like his in-game incarnation. I'm hoping that ultimately, if there is a season 2 or even a third season, we see Dante go through more of a character arc that's believable, one that doesn't feel quite as truncated, and ultimately leads him to be a more recognizable character. And we can't talk about one son of Sparda without discussing the other, so let's chat Virgil. I can't really say all too much about this character because I'm not entirely sure what exactly they've done with him. Much like the special editions of the games though, they've chucked him in right at the 11th hour, right after basically everything has happened, and they're just like, here you go. What we've seen of Virgil runs completely counter to what we've seen in the games. We have Virgil here show up right at the end, willingly, supposedly willingly, serving Mundus as a freedom fighter, doing his bidding. We see him go from Nello Angelo, transforming back straight into Virgil. And then we've got the infamous cheesy line about the storm approaching into the Bury the Light needle drop. I think for me, a lot of the confusion here lies with, is this supposed to be Nello Angelo? Or is this supposed to be Virgil? If we think back to the original Devil May Cry, Nello Angelo barely was sentient at all. He didn't speak whatsoever. He seemed to be completely under the control of Mundus, just doing his bidding. But we see here Virgil basically transform back into his former self and also speak as if nothing's going on. Now, this isn't to say that they've basically thrown away the entire character of Virgil and made their own. If we think back to the Devil May Cry 1 novel, before it was retconned with DMC5, we had Gilva, who basically was Virgil, completely sentient, just doing Mundus's bidding because he was taken as a child and brainwashed and molded into a murderer. Honestly, I'm hoping that that's what they've gone for, because if they haven't, then I feel like this is a step too far for most people when it comes to Virgil and his characterization. Going so far as to willingly give away his amulet, which is something that we know that Virgil in the games would never have done at all. So for Virgil, unfortunately, there's not much that I can say because we don't really know much, but I'm definitely curious. That then brings us on to Lady, who many consider to be the biggest departure from their in-game incarnation. If we strike a parallel to DMC3 again, this version of Lady is slightly more aged up, incredibly foul-mouthed, and their overall motive and objective in life seems to be a little bit different. Sure, they share the same backstory, somewhat, in that a traumatic event in their childhood involving demons tore their family apart, set them on a path of hatred and revenge. The version of Lady we see in-game is hell-bent upon taking revenge against her father Arkham for what he did, but in the show, Arkham is gone. Now, we don't know if Arkham's dead. That might be the implication. It might be in a future season that we do see Lady still take up this quest for revenge when we, surprise, surprise, see that Arkham is still alive, but that remains to be seen. It feels like to me, and this is also something that's a bit of a point of contention in the show, that this lady has a little bit more of a mean streak in her, and she does some things which people could potentially consider irredeemable, where she guns down that entire family of demons, so blinded in her hatred that she doesn't see reason or logic, going so far as to point her weapons at an unassuming and defenseless demon family as they beg for mercy. Something that you would never have seen, I feel, the initial Lady from the games even do. Do I feel like the character is overhated? Potentially, and that's a point of contention. Some of the things that people have been saying has been absolutely insane, but I can understand why people don't like this character, and I can understand why people feel like it's a bit of a downgrade to the Lady that we got in the games. I feel like one of the big turning points for Lady in the show is the fact that she was going through this character arc, very similar to the one that she got in game, where, as we know, she spouted the infamous "even a Devil May Cry" line, but that basically is almost undone entirely with what happens with Banes and Darkcom. And I understand the angle that they're going for here is that she basically was groomed from a young age, and that's one of the parallels that the White Rabbit was trying to strike, particularly with the hatred of humans and demons and the indoctrination. But I feel like the show would have landed a little bit better, or people would have found it more positive, particularly the character, if she had teamed up with Dante in the end. I'm assuming that we'll likely get some form of a redemption arc, potentially in a future season, if it happens, but whether that's going to be enough to sway people on this character, I'm unsure. For me though, I'm still a little bit middle of the road with this character. That does now bring us on to the White Rabbit, what many people consider to be one of the best characters in the show, and for myself included, that also rings true. The White Rabbit for me personally was a bit of a victim of their own success. They were a fantastic villain, they had charm, they had allure, they were malicious, they had an air of mystery about them because we spent so long trying to figure out who they were before the show obviously finally told us. And I feel like why people like this villain so much is because they went more beyond the typical power grabs that you would see in the DMC games, or just with villains in general. They explained his motives quite quite thoroughly, to which a lot of the viewers I feel sympathized and understood why it is that he was doing what he was doing, but I feel like the show had to shoehorn in some ways to make the viewers hate the White Rabbit, even if it ran counter to characterization. The fact that he was sacrificing people that he wanted to save and he was experimenting on, children, I feel like they threw that in there just so that we as the viewer could essentially hate him. And that whole angle, if I'm honest, felt rather cliched overall, as it's something that we've seen before in a lot of media. It was definitely a nice touch to ultimately make the White Rabbit human, and I feel like when they're tackling this notion of demons with a heart and humans who are black-hearted and evil, the White Rabbit was definitely a better rendition than those like Arius, for example. And if for whatever reason they decide to take some things from the show to somewhat put in a future title, I can see the White Rabbit definitely being one of those things that the community would potentially be okay with. With some of the characters out of the way, let's discuss a little bit of the world building and sort of how they framed this story. One of the surprising angles they decided to take with the world building was this notion of realism, where if demons existed, the government would likely know about them, and by and large they would probably know about Dante too, considering his demon hunting escapades. If you want to strike a parallel to the games, then sure, you could argue that in DMC 3 and 5, with those large-scale demonic incursions, the public would likely know what's going on, and there would be some anti-demon measures in place. One of the things that I wasn't the biggest fan of was the scientific lens that they tried to view the demons through, trying to make it so that they were an offshoot of humans. I feel like losing the supernatural aspect of Devil May Cry just hinders it. I don't think it was needed, and I feel like as an extension of that and this scientific lens, I felt like this show was missing some of that more dark gothic atmosphere that Devil May Cry is known for. An even wider scale example of this is the show's portrayal of hell. If you look at hell's incarnations in the game, you typically have the juxtaposition of this dark, visceral, bloody, organic sort of part of hell, compared completely to this almost heavenly, angelic sort of version of hell that completely run at odds to each other, but stylistically feel quite cool. Compare that to what we have here, where things are sort of just barren, desolate, fiery. It seems like an incredibly missed opportunity to not bring some of that aspect from the games into the show. One thing that I didn't see coming was the expansion of demonic politics. Some of this is definitely present in the games. We know that Mundus and Argisax fought over hell. They each shared 50-50, only until Mundus basically ate the Clyfoth fruit, got a power-up, Zenkai boost, whatever you want to call it, and then went on to take the throne of hell. And we know, of course, that after Mundus was basically dealt with, there was a bit of a power vacuum in hell, and there was a bit of a fight and scuffle for the throne, which ultimately Argisax won. What they've done with Makai and the lower rung demons, though, I'm not entirely sure is the right through line for that approach, but I respect the attempt that they went for. I feel like this notion of demons, as I've mentioned, with heart, or humans that are black-hearted and evil, definitely rings true to the Devil May Cry experience altogether, but I feel like if we have every demon with a heart, or maybe not every demon, but a large portion of them who do so, it makes SPARDA less special, in a sense that he's not the only demon with a heart, the only demon who wants peace. He's the only demon who just has the power to do so. For myself, it wasn't necessarily something that I minded, primarily because they were going for the angle that SPARDA is a complete deadbeat, or as the White Rabbit calls him, a completely narcissistic coward. If you've joined in on some of my streams, I often crack jokes about SPARDA being a deadbeat. What the hell was he doing, going out buying a pack of cigarettes or going seeing a man about a dog when his family were being completely murdered and eviscerated? Didn't bother to warn him, put up any protection, charms, whatever. The angle that he ran completely from his consequences is something that I wasn't expecting, but I found quite interesting. We've only ever seen SPARDA be revered as a hero by humans in the games, which obviously leads to problems at times with the Order of the Sword. And we only ever got slight allusions to what demons thought of SPARDA in the games through characters like Beowulf. So to see them put more of a focus on that in the show, particularly with Agni and Rudra basically chastising and twisting the knife at times about Dante and his family, was a little bit different. Whether or not you consider different to be good or not is entirely up to interpretation though. Speaking of surprises, the ending of the show basically came out of nowhere. If you've seen my reaction, you'll see exactly what I thought about it, which was that it was so utterly absurd that it cycled right round through disappointment to just, I'm on for the ride, I want to see where this goes. That is to say, of course, though, that some of the political themes are a little bit more overt this time around, definitely far more contemporary, particularly with what they're talking about with America. Ultimately, if I had to find a hill to die on, draw a line in the sand, so to speak, politics are always going to be part of whatever sort of media that you're going to consume. What they've included in the show here is more overt than you typically see in the games, which is fine. Ultimately, I feel like if they scaled back in the second season, it wouldn't necessarily be all too much of a bad thing, but if they are going to include more, then they should definitely veer more into the absurd and surreal. One final thing I wanted to touch upon before I round this out, I know I've been rambling for some time now, is the overall runtime. And of course, Lady May Cry. It's a joke obviously people are throwing around because Lady has such a presence and a focus, and I don't feel like that necessarily would have been all too much of an issue if people didn't find Lady's personality to be too abrasive. That's particularly why I think people are picking that apart. But if we look at the character arcs and the specific screen time of some characters and where characters are introduced and concepts are introduced, it feels like this first season could have just been the first half of one larger season overall. And ultimately, a lot of our questions and concerns would have been answered, and I feel like it would have been a much more well-received show if that was the case. Other than that, there's only a few other notes that I have. Primarily, I think the animation was great for the most part. CGI not included. I feel like I understand why they did what they did. It doesn't really hold up to the rest of the animation and definitely drags it down in my opinion. The licensed music selection was great for the most part in my opinion. I feel like there's a few other early 2000s bangers that they would have included or should have included. If you look at some of the old early DMC combo videos, there's an absolute plethora of music that they could potentially pull from. But there were some questions that arose primarily looking at the tracks that they pulled from the games. I think the remixes are great, fantastic in that sense, but primarily having DevilNeverCry relegated to just the credits, I feel like there were some instances that they could have used them in the show instead. The inclusion of Devil Trigger, which primarily is a theme for Nero that was included for Dante, again, it feels like they primarily pulled it and used it in the show just because of its popularity with memes. But again, I'm hoping that if there are future seasons that they decide to pull from more of the games overall. I think that's roughly going to do it for me. If I had to wrap it up with a bit of a closing statement, looking at it through the lens of a DMC fan, there's quite a lot that they didn't necessarily hit the mark with. I feel like they definitely could have been more accurate to the games and still provided a bit of a kick-ass experience. I understand, the notion of artistic expression, not wanting to retread the same ground, what is the point in doing things over and over? At the same time, I feel like there is a bit of an importance though to paying homage or paying respects to the source material. And I feel like to create a compelling show, particularly one that pulls in fans and new fans alike, you'll need to strike a balance which I don't quite feel they hit the mark with here. If I look at it for what it is though, and we look at it purely as a show going into it with an open mind, the 7s and 8s that it's been getting are okay. I think that they're accurate. Some issues with a bit of wonky writing, some of the pacing, some of the focus on the characters and stuff. Not perfect by any means, definitely some room for improvement, but I feel like when you look at some of the other video game adaptations out there, it definitely isn't the worst. But then again, is that really all too much of a positive, saying that something isn't the worst? Ultimately, if you want things to get better, then you should definitely be putting your feedback out there in a constructive way. Definitely not just tearing each other down for a difference of opinion, and hopefully, who knows, they might address some of that feedback for whatever they've got cooking up for potential future seasons. With that, we finally come to the end of the video. I'd like to thank all of you for watching in what has been an incredibly lengthy video, more so than usual. If you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing, of course, to stay up to date with anything and everything Devil May Cry. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching once again, and as always, I'll see you all next video.